Hi guys, week 6 of the Vivas. I know this is really close to week 5, but it's okay. So this past Wednesday, we discussed the question, how did the Decian persecution impact early Christianity? So there's a lot of views on this, and a couple of them are that we, as Christians nowadays, we overestimate the amount of state-sponsored persecution. So, you know, we think of Nero as he was like an emperor, and he kind of, you know, inflicted persecution and stuff like that. But it wasn't all like state persecution. It was more of the Roman culture persecution, and more of the Romans disagreeing with how the Christians lived, because they had some pretty weird views about the Christians. So it was more sporadic, but just as severe. And another view people always have is that the martyrs' legacy of helping spread the gospel was way more complex than we really realize, and how controversial it was. So the persecution was intended to remove the Christian culture from Roman society. However, it did not succeed, but it did do substantial amount of harm to the early church. So it did a lot of damage to the early church. It led to divisions within the church and separated the church. It took the Christian culture and emphasized it on martyrdom, and it also popularized the practice of relic collections. So it led to a lot of divisions in the early church, and this is obviously common. Like, it's, I don't know, I think that you could kind of expect that, or maybe you wouldn't, because, you know, if a church is under persecution, you would think that it would be even more united and stand more strong. But under persecution, people are gonna make different decisions that others would not. And so back then, Rome thought that Christians were super creepy, and they had a lot of weird opinions and views on Christians. They thought it was like a secret cult. They thought they were eating children because of communion. And it was just they just had a super creepy view about Christians. And this is a quote from Minius Felix, who was a Roman. And he says, quote, "And now, as wickedness multiplies more quickly, corrupt ways of life are spreading day by day throughout the world." And he's talking about Christians there. So, you know, Christianity was obviously spreading, but a lot of the Roman people thought that they were really weird and creepy, and kind of like this underground cult. So during the Diocletian persecution, Rome made this law that you had to sacrifice at a temple. And after you'd sacrifice, you would like get a certificate or whatever that said you sacrificed and you were good. And it was really like controversial for Christians, and really hard for Christians to decide what to do, because some Christians, you know, sacrificed and, you know, were like, okay, we're gonna sacrifice, get the certificate and be done. Some Christians bought fake certificates because they weren't that hard to make up. And so they bought fake certificates. If they were ever stopped or whatever, they could be like, oh, we did sacrifice, even though they didn't. And some just refused to do it, and they lost almost everything because of it. So it was a super hard time for the Christians, and it really split the church. And so after this persecution, there were like a lot of people, a really good question is how do Christians deal with people who screw up, you know? Because after this, you know, persecution and stuff, all the Christians, you know, repented and were like, oh, you know, we're sorry, we didn't, you know, need to sacrifice. And so the Rigorism is the part of the church that refused to accept anyone who sacrificed. And they were like, no, you're done. And they even like refused to acknowledge the stuff that they did as Christians. So like their baptism or their marriage or funerals. So a lot of stuff had to be repeated because of that, like a second marriage or, you know, second baptism and stuff, which is super interesting. And then the Penson, which is the, you know, kind of true church of today, you know, they were kind of like, all right, we forgive you, you know, we're going to move on, but, you know, don't let it happen again. And so it was just a super duper interesting time for the church, and it really led to a lot of divisions in the church. So my second point is that the Diocletian persecution really like put an emphasis on martyrdom and the role of martyrs. After the, you know, persecution, there was like a lot of, you know, starting to pray to the saints, and they also collected the relics of the martyrs, and they really just like held them in like high standards. So if you think about this, a quote from Dr. Parker was, the Christian martyrs in 250 represented the last movement that Christianity stood in the precipice, which is like a very, you know, firm like rock. And so it was kind of the last point of, you know, when the Christians really were firm, you know, strong believers in Christ. And after that, the church, you know, kind of got into politics and stuff and led into, you know, fake Christianity and just power-hungry people. So you can think of the Diocletian persecution, it was kind of like the last, you know, great generation. Like, as, you know, we think of, you know, World War II as like the last, you know, generation. And, you know, if they didn't, you know, fight back, you know, then we would all be speaking German. And that's kind of like it was for the persecution. Like, if they didn't fight back and they didn't keep going, then Christianity wouldn't have survived. And it almost did die out. And so it's just this super, you know, like precious time. Like, everybody, like, they just really admire the martyrs, and they really like emphasize them in the church and stuff. So, because then in 313 AD, Constantine, he, you know, legalizes Christianity, and he kind of makes it the state religion, and he gives all the money to the church. And so, of course, you know, these people who were power hungry and wanted money would go to the church and, you know, become Christians, you know, and they would be fake Christians. And this is how, like, the kind of, you know, political church comes to be, and how fake Christians come out of this. Because before that, it was very hard. Like, you weren't, like, you don't just go to church. Like, there was a certain service that if you weren't a Christian or you weren't baptized, you couldn't even go to, you know. So it was super intense, and, like, not everybody got to know everything. You had to, you know, like, just, like, actually want to learn and study and stuff. So yeah. And so my third point is that it popularized the practice of relic collection. So as I was saying, that this was like the last great generation of persecuted Christians. And so they had this the Christians, you know, later had this great sense of, like, they were heroes, and they really, like, looked up to them. And because they looked up to them, they actually, like, took their bones and stuff and, you know, made them relics. And you can see them, that they're, like, all, you know, dressed up in fancy gold and jewels and stuff, and they're like these dead martyrs, which is kind of really cool and also kind of really creepy. But this again was very, very controversial issue for the church, and it really split the church, just like some of the sacrifice stuff did, because some people thought that you worshipped the relics, and they, like, honored them so much that they were like, that is, you know, like a false idol, while the others thought it was totally pagan and, you know, did not agree with it at all. And so it was just a very, you know, controversial issue. It divided the church in a lot of ways, as I said, and a lot of people had different opinions on it. You know, Jerome was against the relics, and Thomas Aquinas was for them, and Valerius was against them. And so there was just a lot of, you know, controversially with these relics and stuff. And even though they're super cool to think, like, what those people did, you know, it was like, should we really be worshiping these as much as they were? A great quote from Pauline Fredrickson is, what we do have is tens, and she's talking about what we do. So a little bit before this, she's talking about, you know, how we do not have that many martyrs. Like, people are always like, oh, we have so many martyrs, but we don't have that many martyrs. But what we do have is tens of thousands of people admiring the few who are martyred. And so, you know, there's lots of people who just admire and emphasize and almost worship, you know, these relics of the martyrs and martyrs themselves. And so it was just the Diocletian persecution, like, really affected that, you know, because if they didn't do that, if there was no persecution, there would be no martyrs, you know, and there would be no division in the church. And it's just really interesting to think about, you know, how that made such a great generation, though. And, like, as Christians, we can look back on that and, like, think of them as the last generation that held on to Christianity and, you know, kept it going. And we can, you know, look at these relics as, like, holy and, you know, beautiful, but, like, we shouldn't be worshiping them and stuff. So that was this week's Viva, though, how the Diocletian persecution really affected the church. And yeah, thank you.